I'm Beth Hamaty, and I'm with the Big Country Master Gardeners, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about going native, plant-wise that is. I garden for wildlife. I try to make my home as inviting to butterflies and hummingbirds and birds and lizards. I've had a couple of grass snakes, had baby possums. Now I think that more had to do with my husband not skirting on his shop more than anything else. But they did find lots of nice bugs to eat in my yard. So one of the things about gardening for wildlife is it really helps if you use a lot of native plants. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now this is a little bit different clicker that I'm used to, so I'm going to be going back and forth. And don't worry about the kids. I have grandkids, so I'm not worried about it. So what do we consider a native plant? Well, it depends on who you ask. I was on a Facebook page that was for Texas native plants. And I found out real quick that what I consider native and what some people consider native is very, very different. I had some people say, if it's not native to your county, it's not native. And I said, well, I live in Taylor County, and I'm not sure that gives me a lot to put in my yard. And he said, oh, I looked it up, and it's like 2,000 things that you could plant. And I'm like, yeah, but prickly pear and agarita are not exactly what I want in my yard, you know. What I want and what is in Taylor County is a little different. And then someone says, no. I go by region. And I said, well, do you have a regional map? And she pulls up this map, and it has Texas divided up into like 36 regions. And I was like, okay, that's just insane. So I pulled up the A&M map because, you know, when it comes to horticulture, A&M's kind of the go-to folks. They have, I think it's 6 or 8 regions. I said, that's a lot more reasonable. But still, let's face it. If something's growing in Big Spring or Lubbock, it might be okay here, and the same birds and the same butterflies and the same bees are probably going to be coming to my yard. Now, Houston, totally different situation. Nacogdoches, yeah. Corpus Christi, no. But Texas does have a lot of diversity, and so I think we can be a little bit more open-minded about what natives are. Okay, so I'm not a purist. I have some wiggle room in there. So technically, the term refers to any plant that occurs naturally in a particular region, habitat, or ecosystem. And they're talking about plants that have not been hybridized. You know what I mean by that? They've not been crossed with other things by human beings in order to achieve a certain thing. I don't worry too much about the hybrids. The only concern I have, some hybrids have been shown not to produce as much nectar or pollen as the native. So, for example, I tend to plant regular coneflower instead of some of the fancy double-decker ones because they've done some research on that. But generally speaking, I don't worry too much. If it's blanket flower, I'm not too concerned about whether it's the native blanket flower or one of the fancy hybrids. But that's just me. So I look, is it native to the U.S. first? Okay, and if it's native to the U.S. first, then I feel like I've got a little bit of wiggle room there. Is it in a similar ecosystem? Let's face it, a lot of Oklahoma looks a lot like our part of Texas. A lot of New Mexico looks like a little further west of where we live. So I feel like as long as you're kind of in that rolling plains, short grass prairie, you're in pretty good shape. Same hardiness zone, because there's no use planting something that's not going to survive either our heat or our cold, because that just wastes money. Unless you want to put it in a pot and then stick it in the greenhouse, which I do have a few things that I have in pots and stick in the greenhouse just because I like them. Okay. So why should we embrace native plants? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one, they can handle absolutely delightful Texas temperatures, as we are experiencing right now. You never know what it's going to be. Apparently for the next 3 months, it's going to be over 100. It can deal with our unusual rainfall patterns. As you know, here in Abilene, we get our rainfall in 2 big chunks. We get it in the spring, usually in May, June, and then we usually get it in August, September. We may get some showers in between, and we always pray for showers in between, but that's when we get the most of it. So we kind of have literally drought, flood kind of situations. And not all plants can deal with that. Okay? Native plants tend to be more pest resistant. They've developed in this environment. That does not mean you never have to deal with pests, especially when you have hot temperatures like we do right now. Pests seem to come out of the woodwork, and I've had mealybugs, and I've had lots of aphids, and I know the spider mites are just around the corner because they love the really hot weather. But native plants tend to deal with those things a little bit better. A few years ago, Master Gardeners have a big plant sale, and we bring plants in from different nurseries. But occasionally we will get a plant that has something on it, some bugs of some kind, and we had spittle bug on something. And so we quickly realized what it was, separated it, quarantined it into another room, and we didn't offer it up for sale. So at the end, another Master Gardener and I said, hey, we'll take these 2 plants, see what we can do with them. And so I took it in the nursery pot, stuck it out in my wildflower garden, and in a couple of weeks, those spittle bugs were gone. Because my wildflower garden was full of insects that are going to go after those spittle bugs. Wasp and all sorts of other kinds of things. And sure enough, pretty soon they were gone. Now, my son forgot to water it while I was on vacation and it died anyway, but the bugs were gone. The bugs were gone. Okay, so natives are going to save you money in the long run. You're going to use less fertilizer. I don't use fertilizer much at all, generally speaking. Things that are in pots, yes, I'll fertilize them. And I do put some compost out, maybe once a year, once every couple of years, things along those lines. But lots of times native plants, they like the soil we're in, and they're not really too needy as far as that's concerned. They're probably going to use less water, and they're less likely to need pesticides. Again, I'm not going to tell you you're never going to need to deal with a pest issue, but you're probably going to have less issues with it than you would, say, a fancy hybridized rose. Okay, biodiversity is the key to a healthy ecosystem. All right? There are 40 million acres of lawn in the United States, and these monocultures don't support functioning ecosystems. How many of you know someone who has a yard that looks like that in your neighborhood? Yeah. I would say I live on a kind of a long block, and so there's probably 20 houses, and I would say 90% of them look like that. Some of them look even less hospitable to critters. The folks who live right across the street from me, they have grass and 1 shrub. That's it. That's it. Now, they have young kids. They're busy. I understand. They don't have time to work in the yard. They're dealing with their kids. But if we can have a few more houses that have more biodiversity, that's going to be good for our environment. You can create a little oasis in your neighborhood for bees and butterflies and birds, and they will find you. It may take them a little while, but they will eventually find you. The other day I decided to kind of count how many different plants I have in my yard. Now I'm an overachiever, so just understand. But I'm pushing 100 on different varieties. Not all of them are native. Okay, there are some things that were planted there when I got there. There's some things I planted when I first started gardening that now I wish I hadn't. I have Bermuda grass. It's not native, but these days unless you're going to pull it all out and put in buffalo grass or something like that, it's kind of the way to go because it is pretty drought tolerant. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to do by using natives is helping pollinators. According to the U.S. Forestry Service, non-native plants may not provide pollinators with enough nectar or pollen, or may be inedible to butterfly or moth caterpillars. Okay, now the fact that they say maybe is they're being graceful there. Okay, we know that they don't. We know that they don't. We know that monarchs have to have milkweed, right? And there are certain, tawny emperors, they need either elm or hackberry. Hackberry emperors the same way. Those are 2 kind of tan butterflies, really nice butterflies we have in our area. Things have grown up together. They've developed together over a millennium, and as a result, they tend to depend on each other. Butterflies have a symbiotic relationship with certain plants. Their caterpillars need specific plants to eat. And I think I used this quote last time when I was talking about butterflies and birds. Native oaks support over 500 species of caterpillars. Ginkgo's an Asian import supports 5. Now, not all of those 500 species of caterpillars are going to give you beautiful butterflies. Some of them are going to give you some annoying moths. But here's the deal. Those caterpillars are food for birds. And that's what's really important. Non-natives in the same plant family can sometimes be substituted. I grow bronze fennel for swallowtail butterflies. Before Europeans came along and brought their fennel and their dill and that kind of stuff, basically they lived on wild carrots. Okay? They actually like the fennel better, and they like dill better. So if you've seen some little yellow and black striped caterpillars all over your dill, that's what they are. They're swallowtails. And if you don't want them, bring them to my house, and I'll put them on my fennel. Because a lot of people want their dill and they want their fennel because they want those herbs to use. And that's fine. Just find someone who'll take them off your hands for you. Okay? Now, sometimes, yes, sir?
I was going to say, if you want to keep them on your dill,
Mm-hmm.
keep the dill that you want and plant a couple extra, and then take all the monarchs you find on
All the caterpillars, they put them on the other one.
Stick them on the other one.
I know a lot of people who do that. They plant some for themselves, they plant some for the butterflies, and then they just kind of move them if they need to. So however, sometimes those non-native substitutes can be toxic. We know that there's a certain type of red passion flower that is toxic to some butterflies here in the state of Texas. Usually you grow passion flower for Gulf fritillaries, zebra longwings, and another one is something heliconia. The heliconia and the zebra longweeds are not native to our part of Texas. They're down in the valley. So you could probably grow that red passion flower and not have to worry about it too much. According to research, it doesn't seem to have an impact on the fritillaries. But you want to kind of look at those things. If you're looking to garden for butterflies, kind of keep that in mind. Double check some things. Google them. Usually you'll find information on them pretty quickly. Native bees often prefer native plants and are just as essential as imported honeybees for pollination of crops. How many of y'all knew that honeybees are not native to the Americas? Yeah.
1622.
Yeah. They brought them in with the Europeans. They brought them in to provide them with honey. And they are technically considered livestock. Yeah. But we have lots and lots of native bees. And native bees...
Who brought them in?
I'm sorry?
Who brought them in?
Europeans. Europeans brought them in to provide honey. Sorry, just keep going like this. I'll keep talking about it. I get it. Okay, but our native bees are also out there. They're important. They also do pollination, both of crops and of other kinds of things. And so we want to provide them with enough pollen that they can successfully survive. So there's a big impact on birds, as I mentioned before. Caterpillars, even moth caterpillars, are important to us because they're important to birds. About a third of all birds are insectivores. We put out seeds. But that's usually not what they eat. They eat insects. Now, they'll eat seeds. Some prefer it, but most of them don't. They'll eat it just as kind of one of those things that they munch on the side. The percentage goes up when you're talking about baby birds. The best thing for a mama bird to feed a baby bird is a caterpillar, because caterpillars don't have a hard exoskeleton, so it's easier for a baby bird to eat, and it's full of all sorts of good stuff for baby birds. It takes about 6,000 insects to feed a brood of baby birds. 6,000. And in Texas, most of our native birds will have 2 broods in the summer. So that's a lot of insects. And the insect of choice, caterpillars. Insects often eat only plants with which they have co-evolved. The breeding success of birds is negatively impacted by the use of non-natives. And we are seeing both insects and birds disappear. Last spring, we had a big die-off of insects and we had a big die-off of songbirds, and they don't know what caused it. Could be chemicals, could be climate change. We don't know. But they're disappearing. And that's going to hurt us overall in the ecosystem. So how do I start? How do you start going with natives? We'll go small. Don't rip everything out. Unless you got a new build, and if you got a brand new house and there's nothing in the yard, come talk to me. We'll come up with some good ideas. But basically, add some natives to what you already have. And that's what I did. When I decided I was going to focus on native plants and gardening for wildlife, I just started looking things up. Now, I did find out that sometimes people will tell me this is native, and what they mean is adapted. Adapted is a non-native that's been here a long time, and they handle our climate well, or they come from a similar climate in Africa or Asia or Australia even. So some things I thought were native turned out not to be. Did I freak out about it? A little bit at first. And then I realized, don't worry about it. No plant lives forever. Unless it's a fruitless mulberry tree in your side yard that you really wish would go away. Okay? Big chunks of it have died, but not the whole thing. So, I didn't plant it. It was there when I got there. So, use native plants to replace plants you've lost. Have a plant that's just not working for you, replace it with a native. That was one thing I really had to get used to, this idea, if a plant is not working, it's okay to say, you're done. One, I'm cheap. I don't want to get rid of a plant that I have spent money on. But I finally got to the point, if it can't live in my yard, well, we're not meant to be together. It's just we're just gonna move on to something else. If you have an area that's hard to water, go native. I have a section, I live on a corner, and the section of the outside yard past my driveway is almost impossible to water. And so I just made a wildflower bed. And there is at least one non-native. I've got a vitex, which is not native, but the hummingbirds and the butterflies really like them and they do well. And so I thought, okay, one non-native in a wildflower bed, I'm good. Okay? It won't hurt.
And your wildflower bed is gorgeous.
Well, right now it looks burnt, but most of the time in the spring I get people to drive by and tell me it looks nice, and that makes me feel good. And I enjoy it. But this spring, everything flowered really fast and went to seed really fast. I think it realized that it was going to be a long, hot summer, and they just weren't ready for it. A lot of those plants, however, are going to just go dormant for the heat of summer, and they'll be back in the fall, and they'll rebloom. Yes, ma'am?
So when the rest of the year, does it just bare in there, or what do you do?
It's not. What I'll do is I'll go in and I'll start cutting back the dead parts. I'm going to have to wait till morning when it's pretty cool and get in there and clean it out. And then what usually happens is there'll be part of the plant that's down at the bottom, a little rosette, that's still kind of green. I've got some mulch in there, though I'm going to try to not mulch as much because it hampers the seeds that are coming up from the previous year. So it does not always look great in the summertime, but it'll look better in the fall. I do have some yuccas in there, and they'll look pretty nice throughout the summer and some things like that. So I mixed in a few things. The vitex will continue to look pretty decent. I've got a redbud that's coming up from seed. I don't know where the seed came from, washed in, I assume. And I'm going to eventually move it, but it's too close to the street. But yeah, it doesn't always look like I'd like it to look, but then my whole yard's that way. I mean, it's never everything blooming at one time. That only happens in Good Housekeeping and Lawn and Garden. All those fancy magazines. That's when the only time they go in, they put a bunch of fertilizer out, and then 2 weeks later they come back and take pictures. Nature goes in cycles. And that's just kind of the way it goes. That's the way it works. Okay. How do you know what is native? And these are some great resources. Okay. Generally speaking, you can literally Google, is this plant a native? And then what will happen is it'll come up and it'll tell you where it's from. But if you want to go to specific websites, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, great resource. They've got all sorts of plant files that you can look up information. They've actually got a guy they call Mr. Smarty Plants. And you can ask him questions, and he'll give you information. And he does native plants all over the country, not just in Texas. So if you have something that's a little out of our state, you're okay. Native Plant Society of Texas. We don't have a chapter in Abilene. There's several south and east of us. I think there's one in Lubbock. And I think maybe there's one in Midland, but there's nothing in our area. However, they have a website that has all sorts of stuff, and you can put your county in, and it will tell you the plants that are native to your county, okay, if you're wanting to be that specific about it. But it's a good one when I'm trying to figure out if something is really native or not. National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder. Again, you can go to them and put it in their little search box. And then the Missouri Botanical Gardens has a great resource for native plants. And again, they go outside of just Missouri. They go into other states, so it's a good one. But just Google it or Bing it or whatever search engine you use. Lots of times, I just put it in a question form because I'm old and that's the way I do things. But it usually works. I usually can find the information I'm looking for. So this is what I tell people. Shoot for 70%. As I mentioned before, there are lots of plants that grow in Taylor County that I don't necessarily want in my yard. Okay? So if you can get about 70% of your plants native, you're doing pretty good. That's enough to be supportive of the ecosystem. Now, is that 70% of the individual plants or 70% of the species? I go with species. And the reason I do that is that a lot of the things that are native that I grow are either annuals or perennials, and I have multiples of them in my yard. Okay? So Salvia greggii. I don't know how many Salvia greggii I have. I like salvias, and so I have a ton of them in my yard, and they do really well. Cutleaf daisy, I have it in my wildflower bed. I don't know how many is out there. Bunch. So I tend to go with the species. The 70% of the species in my yard, native. And then you know that you're doing pretty good. Am I at 70%? No, I'm around 50% right now, but I'm working on it. It's a work in progress. So 70% is enough to sustain native insects and birds. And I don't remember the article where I got that number, 70%. But I didn't just like draw it up, say, ooh, 70% sounds good. I actually saw this in an article. The problem is I read lots of stuff and I don't always write everything down. Okay, so let's watch out for some invasive plants. Now, non-native's one thing. Invasive is a whole different level, okay? So you're probably already familiar with things like Johnson grass. Yes, I have some in my yard and in my alley, and it's constant battle. Don't pull those things up by hand. They will cut you. Be sure and put gloves on. Salt cedars, one, I don't know if we have it a lot in Taylor County. We had it a lot where I grew up in Cottle County. But they're both invasive species. They were brought in from other places sometimes for a specific purpose. Sometimes they were brought in accidentally, but they're not very good for us. So you never think of purposely planting these in your yards because you know that they're not good. So there are other things that you definitely want to avoid in West Texas. Now, in Master Gardeners, we joke around about, is a plant invasive or is it hardy? Okay? In our neighborhood, we need hardy plants. But these are definitely invasives. These are going to cause you trouble if you have them in your yard, and they're going to get out and cause other people problems too. So Vinca major, I don't know if y'all know that one. Does this have I don't know if this has a little pointer on it. It's this one up here. It's a pretty little vine with a pretty little blue flower. It's so cute. And then it gets in your yard and it takes over. It will not go away. I had a little bit in my yard when I first moved into my house. I thought, oh, that's so pretty. I'm gonna move some around. Now I can't get rid of it. It's taking over everything. And last summer, we had a lot of stuff going on with family stuff, and I just didn't have time to get out and try to control it like I should have, and now it's really out of control. So I'm going to have to get out there in the 100-degree heat when I should have done it last summer instead of putting it off. Another one is Asian jasmine. My mother had this in her yard in Marble Falls, and it took over. When she had a car accident, we moved her in with my brother, and her house was empty for a little while. We had a guy come mow the lawn, but all he was doing was mowing the lawn. And then we got ready to sell the house, and we spent an entire summer trying to get that and Mustang grapes under control. And Mustang grapes is a native. Nandina, Japanese honeysuckle. Those can be controlled chemically. The problem is usually they're in a flower bed with other things that you don't want to spray. So you have to be kind of careful with it. There are some native honeysuckles, coral honeysuckles one, and there's some hybrid honeysuckles, some bush honeysuckles and such, that are better behaved. So if you really, really, really love honeysuckle and you just want to have it, you might investigate some of the other types of honeysuckle. Might do better. Nandina. My mother, when I first moved into my house, brought me a Nandina. Why? Because she had them growing everywhere in her yard. And it was free, and she wanted to share. And I have an Andina, and I have tried to dig that thing out. I have 3 sons.
Wow.
We got out there with shovels and axes, and we tried to get that thing out, and I got it down below the ground. And we got a big chunk of root out. And you know what? It came right back.
When you get it below the ground,
Uh-huh.
build a fire around that root ball.
I've heard of doing that. And that's probably, I'll have to wait till we have a rainier summer, but yeah, that may be what I have to do. The problem with Andina is it puts out berries, and the birds love the berries, but it's poisonous to some birds. So if you do have an Andina and you can't get rid of it, at least clip the berries off of it. Especially in the fall when we start having migrations of birds and they're really looking for stuff, because it can cause a problem. Most people know about bamboo. It's a grass. It's a giant grass, and it acts just like one. It just grows everywhere. Pyracantha is also called firethorn because it has big thorns on it. It has really pretty berries, and the birds like the berries, and they're okay. But pyracantha has a lot of other issues, and it can get out and get into to wild areas and cause some issues. Outcompete. This is one that's on my hit list right now. Is Chinese pistache. They're coming up all over my yard. I thought they were sumac at first, which is a native, and I thought, okay, a little sumac bush, that'd be okay. I'll keep it pruned back and, keep it under control. And it just started going wild, and they're everywhere. And I don't even know who has one in my neighborhood. When I start looking around the neighborhood, all I see are oaks and pecans. So I don't know where they're coming from, but the birds are eating the berries on them, and they're planting those seeds in my yard. Yes, sir.
Don't we recommend those as native or adapted trees for our area?
Probably. And that's one of the things that I see all the time. How many of y'all know Birds in Blooms? Anybody know that magazine? I take it all the time. And I'm on their Facebook page. And they will have an article that says, this is invasive, don't plant it. And then they'll have another article that says, hey, this is great adapted plant. So, it's just one of those things. You got to watch out for it. Lots of times things that we brought in, we thought were going to be good until we put them in the environment and we found out they caused problems. Okay. English ivy is another one. Oh, yes, ma'am.
What's a
Pyracantha is a big shrub. It has thorns on it. It has orange to orange-red berries. And they can get big. My parents had one when I was growing up that was probably 15 feet tall. And I see them occasionally. They have a lot of issues with pests in our area. And so I don't think we recommend it because of that. But you do see them still. And they will get out, like I said, into wild areas and reproduce and out-compete some of the natives. English ivy's one, it's pretty. It looks nice growing up the side of a house until it starts destroying the brick and, taking over the trees and, that kind of stuff. But for a long time, it was, one of those things that was a pretty good recommended tree. And I do think Chinese pistache, now that you mentioned, I think it's on the A&M site as a recommended tree. So, even A&M can be wrong. Don't tell anyone I said that.
Say Midland Master Gardeners, that's one of their recommended trees.
Yeah. It's a good tree. It grows fast. It's going to give you good shade. But, man, those seedlings get out, and they're everywhere. And they're coming up all over my yard. Don't know where they're coming from. Not my yard, but they're coming from somewhere. Okay. So what should you plant? So what are some good native plants that we use here in Abilene that will do well for you? So these are just some of my favorites. I just pulled out things that I like and things that you'll find in my yard. So for small to medium trees, redbuds. They bloom in the spring. You'll get the blooms first. They're one of the earliest blooming plants. So you'll get butterflies on them. They're a good early nectar plant. Anacacia orchid, which is actually native to a little bit further south, but it can handle our winters. That's, lots of times when things are from a little further south, that's the biggest question. Can it handle the cold? And I have several friends who have these. We do sell them at Master Gardener Plant Sale occasionally. I don't have one because every time we've had them at the plant sale, they've sold out. So by the time Master Gardeners were buying, they were all gone. But I'm going to get one eventually. Some other things that are really nice for your yard, Yelpon hollies. I have a yaupon in my front yard. I'm fixing to put another one in the backyard. It puts out really pretty red berries in the wintertime. It is evergreen. I have a pair of mockingbirds that have laid claim to that yaupon. And back during the big freeze, what was it, the blizzard of 21, we had a whole flock of cedar waxwings come through, and they tried to get on that yaupon, and those mockingbirds defended their territory valiantly and were successful. They drove off that entire flock of cedar redwings, and I don't think they got a single one of those berries. Possum haw is another one that's a little bit, it's native to south of here. If you've ever been out in the Austin area and you've seen shrubs along the fence row and they just covered in red berries in the wintertime, that's possum haw. Now, you have to have the female. She's the one that puts the berries on, but you need to have a male somewhere in the area, which I didn't know. And so mine does not put out a lot of berries because I don't think it gets pollinated enough, because I don't think there's enough in the area to cross-pollinate, but I do get some, and it's nice. In town, in your yard, it'll make a little tree. It'll make a pretty decent-sized tree, actually. In the country, it's going to be shrubby because it doesn't get as much water. Desert willow is another one. It's a little more native to a little west of us, but lots of people have them. They do really, really well. At the corner of North 10th and Willis, the CVS has them in their landscaping, and they're big. I've never seen desert willows get that big, and it's probably because they get water all the time. Mine's in the backyard, and it's stayed fairly small, but it's not very old, so it may get bigger. There's a lot of different versions. It has a pink flower on it. There's a hybrid called Bubba that gives you a darker pink, kind of a magenta colored flower. They grow wild in New Mexico and far west Texas, but they're a nice one. Hummingbirds like them. Butterflies like them. Some good shrubs. Now, I will say this. Shrubs are kind of a tough one for our part of the country. There's not a lot of things that are native, so this is an area you may have to kind of, find what works. Dwarf yaupon is one I recommend all the time when people ask me for an evergreen shrub. It gets about 4 by 4. They'll tell you 3 by 3, but it's about 4 feet wide by about 4 feet tall. You can prune it down if you want to. You can let it grow, just on its own. It won't put out berries, but it will put out little flowers in the spring that the bees like. And so you'll get a lot of them. And my birds like it for cover because it's pretty dense. It can handle the heat. It can handle the cold. And it's evergreen. Evergreen sumac, another one. Now, sumacs tend to be a little on the wild side. You have to do some pruning on them. You have to kind of keep them under control. But they give you beautiful color in the fall. This is one right here. And you can see the orangey red leaves. Beautyberry is one that's deciduous. It's going to drop its leaves. It needs some shade. It doesn't need all-day shade, but it needs a little bit of shade, particularly in the heat of the afternoon. And it's going to give you those pretty purple berries. Now, people tell me that those berries are beautiful all winter long. I don't know, because my mockingbirds strip them as soon as they get purple. And then they poop purple all over the place. But I love my mockingbirds. I put up with stuff. That's just the kind of the way it goes. Nothing's perfect. Sometimes there's a downside. But they're a really pretty plant. I've got one in the front yard and one in the backyard, and the birds really do like the berries on them. I don't think it was the mockingbirds that caused all the problem. I think it was the dove, but either way. Texas sage, Cenizo, Silverado sage. It gets called by a lot of different names, barometer plant. Again, it's native to slightly further west than we are, but they do great here in Abilene. They can handle the drought. They can handle the cold, and they are gorgeous. They've got some new varieties out that stay smaller. They've got some new varieties that are a little bit bigger. There's one called Green Cloud where the leaves are not as gray. They're more green. They've also got a new one out that's supposed to be less sensitive to humidity, so it blooms more frequently. Lots of times these will bloom when the humidity's up. So that's why people say they predict the rain and things like that. Humidity pops up, they're going to go, they'll start blooming. They're a desert plant. They're taking advantage of that moisture. But they're a great one. And again, hummingbirds like them, butterflies like them, birds like them in general. Agurita. Now, if you don't mind hollies with their sharp, pointy leaves, then Agurita would work for you. It tends to be a little more scraggly than a lot of our hollies, but the leaves are pointy. It has red berries on them. You'll see them all around this area out in the pasture. But they can be grown in a flower bed and trimmed up and work about as good as a holly will. I don't particularly like the pointy leaves, so I don't have one. But I've been debating about putting one in my wildflower bed and just kind of letting it do its thing. Again, still debating on that one. Because I suspect at some point I'm going to have to get in there and fight those leaves. Texas mountain laurel is a great little Texas tree. It's evergreen. It puts out these beautiful purple flowers. Mine has not bloomed yet because they have to get to a certain height before they start blooming. But they look like wisteria. The only downside to Texas mountain laurel is they grow very slowly. If I had known this, I would have invested in a slightly larger plant when I bought, but I'm cheap, so I bought the little teeny tiny one, and it's right now getting just under the eave of the house, and I've had it probably 7 years. So it's taken it quite a while to get to that size, but they're great. The butterflies love them. They're a pretty plant. They're nice and green in the wintertime, so they work really well. I have mine pruned up like a little tree, but you could do it as a shrub or a tree, either one. Okay, some perennials. I have lots and lots of perennials in my yard. I'm kind of a perennial person. I like plants that I don't have to buy and replace every year, and perennials are my go-to. So, autumn sage, Salvia greggii, which is the red and the purple here, comes in just about every color that you can imagine. It's a Texas native. It'll give you some beautiful blooms in the springtime. Then it kind of goes semi-dormant in the summertime, doesn't do a lot. And then in the fall, you get more really pretty flowers. That's one of the ones I highly recommend for hummingbirds. They love salvia. Salvia greggii in particular. Like I said, just about every color you can imagine. Purple coneflower is a good one. It is a prairie plant, so it's native. I find mine do better with a tad of shade. I know some folks who grow theirs in full sun, but mine seem, everything likes a little sun in the afternoon in Texas in the summertime. So I actually got them under a pecan tree that's limbed up pretty good. I've got them under an oak tree, and they do really well. Really, butterflies really, really like them. Turk's cap. Turk's cap is one of the few things that we have that will bloom in the shade. And it likes a little sun, but it can handle pretty full shade. And it's another one that I recommend for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds absolutely love it. Yes, ma'am?
Turk's cap,
Mm-hmm.
is that a real spreader?
It can be.
Okay.
It can be. It can. It's going to put out seed, and it's going to put up babies. And I figured that out a little late, and now I'm pulling them up. And sometimes I pot them up. Sometimes I just pull them up. But yeah, it can do a little spreading. I tend to give mine room and just let it kind of do its thing. But the one I have in my front yard, I thought was 2 plants, and then I really pruned them back this winter to see what was what. And it's more like it's about 7 plants now. So I'm going to have to do some digging in the fall when things cool off and move some things around a little bit. But yeah, and it's one of those that you could, if you wanted to put it along a fence and just kind of let it take over that fence line, would work really, really well. Coreopsis, you'll see this growing out on the roadside. There's lots of different varieties. I prefer the original, which is the plain slants leaf Coreopsis. It grows, it will reseed. It's easy to pull up though. When it's little, the roots are not real deep. So if it comes up somewhere you don't want it, I just pull it up and put it in the compost pile. But it'll give you some really great flowers in the spring and then again in the fall. Greg's mist flower, we call it butterfly crack because butterflies adore this, particularly monarchs. And queens does well in part shade, but I have seen it in full sun and it did pretty well there too. It's another one that'll kind of spread. Okay, it really will spread. It's hardy. So you have to control it a little bit, but you don't have to pamper it, that's for sure. See, we got Texas betony, or Gaillardia, blanket flower. We used to call this Indian blanket. Now we just call it blanket flower. and there's some hybrid versions of it, but it does really good in the heat, and it's a wildflower. But I think it is a perennial wildflower. Bethany does well in the shade. It definitely needs shade, and it actually looks like a type of salvia, and I think it's probably in the same family because they both have square stems. Lantana, we all know lantana. Now there's some lantanas that are native, and there's some lantanas that are not. If you look, some places will have the Latin on there. If it's the Camara, that's the one from Mexico. But I'll be real honest, if it can survive my winter, I'm not terribly worried about where it's from. It's closely related enough to the Texas native that I don't worry about it as long as it can survive. So the New Gold is a good one. There's a Trailing Purple. There's a Trailing White. There's a whole series called the Bandana series, which are pinks. Confetti. Some of those don't handle our winters real well. That good old-fashioned orange one, yeah, it will. There's another one called, they used to call it eggs and ham. I don't know what it's really called, but it's yellow and pink. That's where the eggs and ham come in. And it can handle our winters. I've got one that's a Dallas Red, which is more red than yellow. I've planted it on the south side of my house, and it made it through the big freeze. So now it was established. I had some things that were not established that didn't do so well. But it had been there for a while. But I did plant on the south side because it's zone 8 is its upper level. And we're 7, 8, depending on the winter. And so I did put it in an area that was kind of sheltered. Tall asters. These are great in the fall. They're a great nectar plant for any butterflies in the fall. You can get some blooms on them in the summertime, but I like to go ahead and cut them back. Otherwise, in the fall, they tend to flop over. And so I don't worry. I just use them kind of as a ground cover in the summertime and keep them about that tall. And then once fall comes, then I'll let them bloom. And they bloom profusely. They're another one. If they get where I don't like them, I'll start pulling them up, getting them to friends, things along those lines. Rock rose is another one. It looks like a little hibiscus. And I planted mine in full sun. And then I started reading just recently how it's recommended as a shade plant. And I have some in the shade. The birds planted it, and it's doing well. As a matter of fact, this summer, what's in the shade is actually doing better than what's in the sun. But it can get pretty good size, and then it dies back in the winter, and I cut it off to the ground. But it'll get, about like that.
Very hardy.
Very hardy. Very hardy. And it's another one it's going to put out some seeds, and it's going to put out some babies. Again, I pull them up. Usually what I did, I had to really thin them out this year because I had a lot. So after we had one of those really good rains, I went out like right after that rain and started pulling out, and I got root, and I got most of them out. Oops, sorry. And they weren't too hard to pull out in soft ground. They were fine. Engelmann daisy, which is this one down here. It's also called cutleaf daisy. It's a great wildflower, but it looks pretty good. Now again, it'll bloom in the spring. And then it'll look kind of ratty, so you cut it down to the basal rosette, and then in the fall, it'll come back. Red yucca, we know red yucca. And phlox. Phlox is not something I've had a lot of, but I've had several master gardeners give me some. And mine are doing really well this year. I've got them in the backyard where they get a little bit of morning shade till probably about noon, and then sun the rest of the day. So they're getting some of the real heat. But they seem to be doing okay. So some grasses, Mexican feathergrass. It's another one that's hardy. It will come up all over the place, but I just pull it up. It's not hard to pull up. Sometimes I'll pull it up and stick it in a pot, and it'll root fine. Sometimes it dies, so I don't worry about it, But it's really pretty in the springtime. Now, it's cool weather, so it's going to bloom in the spring and give you the little inflorescence on the top. And it can get a little ratty looking in the heat of summer. The thing about Mexican feathergrass that I found out is you don't cut it back like you do with other native grasses or ornamental grasses. You put gloves on and kind of comb out all the dead and leave the green behind, and it works pretty well. And at first I got a little frustrated with it because it was coming up all over the place, and then when I figured out how easy it was to pull it up, I was just like, It's good. Indian grass is good if you want a nice tall, instead of something like coral forest or reed grass. Indian grass will work. Little blue stem is really pretty. It's blue-green in the spring and summer, and then it turns kind of rusty red in the fall. You'll see it all along the roadsides, but it's really pretty. And then pink muley. Pink muley is a little bit native, a little more further south, and so it takes a little bit more water to get it established than, say, just the regular white muley, white cloud, or some of the others. There's also one called bamboo muley, which I've seen in the Austin area, and it does really well. I don't know if it does well here, but the pink muley has the pink flowers in the fall, and it's really, really pretty. Okay, ground covers. Frog fruit. I love frog fruit. This is the flower. This is what the plant looks like. I don't know why they call it frog fruit, but it's native. It's also host to a small butterfly called the crescent. There's several different kinds of crescents, but it grows in the sun, it grows in the shade, it grows all over. It's another one that is hardy. So if you have a place that you want something to cover the ground and nothing else is working, it's growing under my fruitless mulberry. Okay? Now, if y'all don't know what a fruitless mulberry is, it's a big giant weed that doesn't even make good firewood, but it has really good shade, and it is very deep shade, and yet frog fruit will grow under it. And some of the frog fruit I bought, but I also had some I started. I was at my grandson's soccer game, and it was growing in the grass on the soccer field. And I just pinched up a runner, took it home, put it in some soil, kept that soil wet, and guess what? It grew. So if it can handle the sun of a soccer field or the shade of a fruitless mulberry, that'll grow anywhere. And I'm actually going to start using it more. I'm going to try to use more of what we call green mulches. Instead of wood mulches, use low-growing plants to keep the ground insulated. Passion vine's a good vine. Again, hardy. It'll come up all over the place. It'll come up in your yard. It'll come up in the cracks of the street. But I just pull it up where I don't want it. And it is hard to root from when you pull up the little pieces because they're actually all part of the same root system. And so there's not much root if you just pull it up. You have to kind of dig it up and pamper it a little bit till you get it started. But once you got it started, you got it, and it'll go all again. It's borderline aggressive, I would say. Coral honeysuckle, much more mannerly as far as honeysuckles are concerned, and it's blooms early usually, likes full sun. Hummingbirds like it. It's a good one. It's not going to get humongous. At least mine hasn't. Now, mine did freeze back in the big freeze a couple of years ago. It froze back to the ground, but it came back. Normally in the wintertime, it doesn't freeze back. It'll drop a lot of leaves, but usually it'll make it through. This is silver ponyfoot, and this is a hybrid of a little plant called dichondra. Most people could treat dichondra as a weed. But if you've got a place that's kind of wet, like it's where your air conditioner drain comes out and it's always kind of muddy there, dichondra's great. The silver version works well in shade. I use a lot of time in flower pots. Now, I don't know if the silver version can handle our freezes. The green can, because I've got some in a flower bed. So it works well. My son's using it in Denton as a ground cover in an area that's got lots of shade and it's kind of wet. It's a low spot in his yard. And he says, "What is this stuff coming up?" And I said, "It's ground cover. Leave it alone. Just it's good. It's fine." And he says, "Yeah, it really covered and it's not muddy back there." And I was like, "Yeah, I told you." He doesn't know people think it's a weed. He doesn't need to know that. Okay, so don't forget your lawns. Now, I have Bermuda grass. If I could afford to rip out all that Bermuda grass and put in something else, I would. And I'm trying to talk my husband into it. And he's actually kind of leaning towards it. We're going to see. But there are some native grasses that you can use. Now, they're not going to be the same as tiff, okay? They're not going to look like a golf course. Matter of fact, most of the lawn grasses we have, that's why they were brought to the United States, was to use on golf courses. And so Bermuda and St. Augustine are actually native to Africa. What we have is buffalo grass. And this is what buffalo grass looks like. It's not going to get real tall. 8 inches is about as high as it's going to get. You can mow it, but you don't want to mow it real low. You want to keep it about 4 inches. Okay? Now, buffalo grass is a bunch grass, meaning it grows in a little cluster. And so some folks feel like that leaves too much room for weeds. So we've got a couple of different plants you can go put with it. Blue grama grass, prairie drop seed, those can be added to them. And that's what they've done with these down here. This is that's blue grama, this is drop seed. And the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has created what's called Habiturf, which is a combination of bluegrass and I think the blue grama. I don't remember exactly, but it's a combination of native seeds. And then Native American Seed has put together one they call ThunderTurf, and it's buffalo grass, blue grama, and a little grass called curly mesquite. And so when you put them together, then you end up with something that covers a little bit better than just buffalo grass by itself. But if you're looking at maybe changing out your lawn, or again a new build and you're looking at putting in lawn, you might want to check with these two sources. Native American Seed is a company out of Junction. The guy who started it was a landscaper in the Metroplex. He lived through the summer of 2011, which I think we're going to have another one, where it's just hot, 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 hot. And he began to realize that all the people he was working for were spending all this money on water trying to keep non-native plants alive. And so he started getting into this idea of natives. So he sells native seeds, and if you go to their website, you can get a free catalog. And the catalog's just fun. But you can check with them and go online and get the catalog. The catalog's interesting because it not only has seeds in it, but they have books, and they also have some articles that are really interesting. Okay. For more information on the impact of native plants on the environment, this is a video that came out a few years back. It's by a guy named Doug Talamay. He's really done this massive amount of research on native plants and their relationship to birds, particularly songbirds. And so I highly recommend it. It's 45, maybe an hour long, but it's really, really interesting. And some of the information I've given you is from his YouTube program. I also mentioned here you can order a free catalog for Native American Seed from www.seedsource.com. And thanks for coming out.